The movie opens inside the early 2000s in a retirement domestic. Sitting alone in a wheelchair is Frank Sheeran, Robert De Niro. He reflects on his lifestyles main up to wherein he is now, beginning together with his career as a residence painter, in different words, a hitman. In the 1950s, Frank, a World War II veteran, lives in Pennsylvania operating as a truck driving force for a meatpacking organization. He's married to Mary Alexa Palladino and has a daughter, Peggy Lucy Guyena. In his paintings, he meets Russell Bufalino, Joe Pesci, who advises him to get his truck fixed. When Frank asks Russell his call, he instead changes the problem before bidding Frank farewell. Frank starts to rub elbows with local gangster Felix Skinny Razor DiTullio Bobby Cannavale, offering him with some of the goods he carries. On a shipping, a customer sees that Frank's truck is empty, and his employers accuse him of stealing. Frank is going to attorney Bill Bufalino, Ray Romano, who facilitates Frank avoid felony repercussions by way of telling him to not surrender the names of all and sundry that he changed into promoting to. Later on, Bill formally introduces Frank to Russell, who is his cousin. Frank and Russell eat together, wherein Frank discusses his time within the conflict, and the way he was skilled at doing away with enemy infantrymen. Frank is asked by way of a gangster referred to as Whispers Paul Herman to take out Russell and his pal Angelo Bruno Harvey Keitel. Frank doesn't undergo with it and instead brings this records to Russell and Angelo, and when Frank gives to return the money to Whispers, Angelo assures Frank that he gain't be desiring it anymore. One afternoon, Frank is going home to peer that Peggy is looking upset. Mary tells him that she knocked something over at the grocery store and the shop owner shoved her. Frank takes Peggy lower back to the store where he violently confronts the shop proprietor, beating him and throwing him via the glass door earlier than assaulting him in the road, in full view of Peggy and others strolling through. This leads Peggy to turn out to be fearful of her father. Russell brings Frank in on his crime business as a hitman, and he will become nicely familiar with some of different gangsters, the on-screen textual content letting us understand how they all died horribly. During this time, Frank leaves Mary for a woman named Irene Stephanie Kurtzuber, and that they later have different daughters, Connie and Dolores. He is in the end contacted by way of Union Chief Jimmy Hoffa, Al Pacino, after hearing about his work portray Holmes. Present-day Frank informs us that there's extra to Jimmy that people don't understand apart from his famed disappearance. Jimmy leads the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, and is also in league with Russell and his gang. Jimmy additionally has an issue with Teamsters Vice President Tony Provenzano, Stephen Graham, as he has his personal plans for his commercial enterprise. Frank will become a bodyguard for Jimmy, and he also brings him along to meet the circle of relatives. Peggy is most keen on Jimmy, even greater so than she is of Russell, whom she is aware of his horrific information. Jimmy and his Teamsters are staunchly against the Kennedys, which makes JFK's election in 1960 hit a serious nerve for Jimmy. He rants to his men, and with Frank within the room, he thinks he's yelling at him too, however Jimmy assures Frank that he isn't, consisting of him within the rant. After JFK is assassinated, Jimmy makes an insensitive remark to the clique that Bobby Kennedy, Jack Houston, the previous general attorney, is now just every other legal professional. Bobby later forms a squad to go after Jimmy, and he is finally arrested for jury tampering. In Jimmy's absence, the Teamsters is taken over via Frank Fitzsimmons Gary Basaraba, who starts a revolve to use the institution's finances for himself or to make loans to the mob. In prison, Jimmy reveals that Tony Pro is likewise there for extortion. Tony makes a few attempts to hash out his problems with Jimmy, however they could reach an agreement, and it simply results in him entering into a brawl that's broken up by way of guards and different inmates. During a parade, a random mobster is shot dead in the middle of a crowd. Frank and Russell parent that the gunman turned into sent by means of Crazy Joe Gallo, Sebastian Maniscalco, who works with black gangsters to carry out his dirty work. As the call indicates, Joe is a hot-headed loose cannon. On his birthday, Frank and Russell accompany Joe to see Don Rickles' Jim Norton carry out, wherein Joe almost snaps at Rickles for a joke. The mobsters agree that Joe is an excessive amount of a legal responsibility, so Frank is sent to take him out. Present-day Frank recalls selecting particular guns to do the task. He catches Joe having dinner together with his circle of relatives at Umberto's, whereupon he shoots at Joe before following him outside and completing him off in the streets, then making a getaway. Jimmy is released from prison after Richard Nixon gives him a presidential pardon, but he can't cross again to the Teamsters. Regardless, Jimmy makes an effort to rise return to power, which includes dumping on other Teamster leaders and disregarding crime-owned family sports. Russell asks Frank to talk to Jimmy about his conduct, but Jimmy assures Frank that he can't be harmed, otherwise each person involved will visit jail. We then saw to 1975 where Frank, Russell, Irene, and Russell's wife Carrie, Catherine Narducci, are headed to a wedding for Bill's daughter. The film was slicing to and fro among this on account at the start. Russell tells Frank that it's time for Jimmy to be sorted. Frank arrives in Detroit after Jimmy is set to satisfy with Tony Pro and Anthony Giacalone Patrick Gallo. Jimmy is surprised to look Frank together with his foster son Chucky O'Brien, Jesse Plemons, and fellow gangster Sally Bugs, Louis Cancelmi, after questioning Tony Pro stood him up. He is instructed that the assembly has been moved to every other house where Tony and Russell are waiting for him. Frank takes Jimmy to the residence, where Jimmy finds that it's empty. Growing frightened and suspicious, Jimmy begins to stroll out, only for Frank to shoot him 2 times inside the lower back of the head. Frank leaves Jimmy's body there, and it's far later picked up by way of other men who cremate his body. Jimmy's disappearance becomes national news. The Sheeran circle of relatives watches at domestic, and after Frank offhandedly mentions he hasn't known as Joe, Jimmy's wife but, Peggy, now performed via Anna Paquin, realizes her father had something to do with something took place to Jimmy. Present-day Frank informs us that that is the day that Peggy stopped talking to him. Frank, Russell, Tony Pro, and others are arrested for suspicions of Jimmy's disappearance, while guys like Sally Bugs are murdered. Tony Pro dies, while Frank spends one closing moment with Russell in jail earlier than Russell is wheeled away to the clinic, where he later dies. Frank is later launched from prison and is sent to the retirement domestic. He has been recognized with cancer and he can slightly stroll. He visits Peggy at her bank activity, but she walks away the instant she sees Frank, at the same time as he begs her to talk to him. His tries to reconcile along with his different daughters is likewise unsuccessful. With this, Frank in reality prepares for his loss of life. He alternatives out her inexperienced coffin and the spot where he wants to be buried. At the end of the night time, Frank is taken to his room by using an orderly. He asks the orderly to go away, the door open, holding out wish that perhaps a person in his circle of relatives will still care to go to him. Frank, the Irishman, Sheeran recounts his existence tale whilst in a retirement domestic. He was a World War II veteran who labored as a truck motive force for a meat-packing agency before he commenced to befriend gangsters. He is added to Russell Bufalino, head of a prime crime family in Pennsylvania. Russell brings Frank on as a hitman after mastering of his competencies killing enemies inside the war. Through Russell, Frank meets union leader Jimmy Hoffa, who brings Frank on as his bodyguard. Jimmy receives into problem with the regulation and is going to prison. On the outdoor, Frank keeps to work for Russell, even killing a hot-headed gangster named Crazy Joe Gallo for him. After Jimmy receives out of prison, he tries to regain his function of energy, however his mindset does not sit nicely with Russell and different crime family heads. In 1975, Frank and Russell visit a wedding with their wives for Russell's niece. He informs Frank that Jimmy now has successful on his head. They persuade Jimmy that he is to fulfill with other Teamster leaders, simplest for Frank to get him on my own and kill him. Jimmy's frame is disposed of, which results in his famed disappearance. Knowing Frank changed into concerned, his daughter Peggy never speaks to him again. Frank, Russell, and others involved in Jimmy's disappearance are arrested. Russell dies in prison, while Frank is later released, albeit on my own and unloved in spite of everything that he's executed. He spends his final years getting ready for his inevitable death.